Hello and welcome to Inside Infrastructure, an inside look at the decisions and decision makers behind Australia's city-shaping infrastructure. I'm Ilya Zak from series sponsor PwC Australia, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Adrian and Ilya, CEO of Infrastructure Partnerships Australia. For today's episode, we have part one of a two-part episode with Michael Brennan, the chair of one of Australia's most treasured and important institutions, the Productivity Commission.
So, Michael Brennan, welcome to Inside Infrastructure. I wonder, we'll get into your current role as chair of the Productivity Commission shortly, but I wondered if you could maybe just talk us through your career background and who you are.
Sure, thanks, Adrian, and it's a great pleasure to be here, to be participating in the debate. Prior to being in the current role as chair of the Productivity Commission, I was working in the Commonwealth Treasury. So there I was the Deputy Secretary of the Fiscal Group, which had, the name suggests, responsibility for the Commonwealth budget, but a few other things besides. It was also Commonwealth-state relations, a bit of social policy. It also had retirement income superannuation policy within it as well. And prior to being in the Commonwealth Treasury, I'd been in the Victorian Treasury. And I'd also had a bit of a background working in some ministerial offices. So I worked in the Victorian government many years ago in the 1990s as an advisor to Alan Stockdale during the period of the Kennett government. And I'd worked a bit in the Howard government as an advisor to Nick Minchin, and in between worked at PwC as well in the economics and policy practice. So to the extent you can take some unifying narrative thread and put it through all those beads, I guess I would say that I've been in and around the public policy debate for my career, which is now getting on for not quite 30 years, but nearly, but from a range of different vantage points, state and Commonwealth, private sector, public sector, and both within the bureaucracy, a bit within ministerial offices, and now in an arm's length independent think tank. So to some extent, had seen a range of perspectives and a range of vantage points on a number of issues which have come and gone and evolved over that period.
Those two ministerial offices that you mentioned, those were pretty well known as some of the most active reformers of the last couple of decades. Would have been some pretty exciting initiatives that you worked on during that time. Anything in particular that stands out?
Well, they were interesting times in different ways. I mean, the period in Victoria in the 1990s was clearly a period of quite dramatic reform on a range of fronts, economic and fiscal. And my responsibility was more on the budget side than the broader economic stuff. But I did get a bit of a window or a lens on things like energy privatisation and other outsourcing deals like transport and the like. In the period in which I was working in the finance portfolio in Canberra was an interesting period too, because, again, a heavy fiscal focus. I was on the deliberations of the Expenditure Review Committee over that period. In one sense, people can look back often a bit nostalgically on that period as a period where a lot of fiscal aggregates looked in pretty good shape. The budget was in surplus, debt was low, ultimately debt got eliminated. The flip side of that is it wasn't always a particularly rewarding time to be on the finance or treasury side of the table, because it was almost the case that money was so plentiful that we lost a lot of arguments around that table. It was difficult at times to maintain discipline in that circumstance. I greatly value the time that I spent there. It was a fascinating period, but all these things, there are pros and cons.
That's a very unique perspective on that period. Well, it's because a lot of reform, but at the same time, obviously, just a mountain of revenue that was coming in that makes the job, ironically, makes the job more difficult for people that are trying to implement some kind of rigorous approach to expenditure as well.
One of the things that interests me about that period is looking back, and you mentioned the nostalgia for that time, and it extends, Hawke, Keating, and through the Howard years. The nostalgia implies that this was this really coordinated process of reform, but often I've spoken to people who are involved with the national competition policy work who sort of said it looks a lot more ordered and coherent in retrospect than it perhaps was at the time. I'd kind of be interested in your view, and being in those offices and observing what was happening and being involved to some extent with what was happening, did it seem like a sort of was it a structured process? Were the ends defined and then it was delivered, or were things more fluid and pragmatic and incremental in the way they really came together?
Yeah, my sense is things are always a little more fluid and pragmatic than they often appear outwardly. The flip side is, given that that's a reality of policymaking, I think there are probably some periods of policymaking and some leaders within the process who've done a better job at having a coherent, unifying sense of what it was that they were out to achieve. And I think that is a very important ingredient in good public policy, such that people might be picking their moments and they might be experiencing some setbacks along the way. There'll be plenty of bumps and bruises, but at least in their own mind, they've got a reasonably clear-headed sense of where they're trying to take things. And I think in both the periods you mentioned, the period of the 1980s and early 1990s, though I was very young and not immediately connected with it, I think there was at least a bit of a sense of a coherent, unifying sense of where the then government wanted to take the country. And I think that was true too of the Howard Costello years as well. But I'm kind of professionally averse to too much nostalgia as well, partly because I think it's just such a natural human tendency to look back on the past with a kind of
rose-coloured glasses.
Yeah, correct. Rose-tinted view. I was reflecting only last night with someone about the current pandemic and the various strictures it's forced upon us, and we were agreeing that one day people are going to look back very nostalgically on this period, much as they looked back very nostalgically on the Second World War. And you think, well, really? I mean, this was a period of great challenge in many ways and great restriction. So I think there's a natural tendency towards nostalgia, and as policymakers, we have to be a little bit professionally dubious about that, I think, and really question it, given that we know that there's a natural tendency towards it. So part of what I worry about a bit is that sometimes that nostalgia translates into a kind of negativity or pessimism about the present and about the current state of policymaking. And I tend to be much more of an optimist. I think that the policy capability at both the state and Commonwealth level is strong. I think, in the course of this challenge, we've seen the Federation rise to the challenge in many ways. So I think there is always, it always pays to take a glass half full view, and I think there's good grounds for it as well.
And we're going to come to the maybe some of the opportunities through the current crisis and as we emerge from the recovery soon. There are a couple of areas I want to tackle first. So I wonder, so going to your current role then, Michael, you were offered the role as Productivity Commissioner. You'd been in the Federal Treasury. What was it that made you take a position that is, as you said, an independent think tank, arm's length from government? What was it that attracted you to that route rather than a more senior role in the public service?
Well, the first thing is I've never been particularly ambitious about where I wanted to head in the public service. So the job that I had in Victoria, which was the Deputy Secretary of the Economic Group within the Victorian Department of Treasury and Finance, I regarded as the greatest job in the Victorian public sector, and I still do. I think it's the greatest job you can have in the VPS, and I never had an ambition to do anything else. But when I had the opportunity to go and work in Canberra under John Fraser in the Commonwealth Treasury, I thought that too was a great opportunity, so I went and did it. But I never had a particularly clear sense of what a path beyond that job was. Now, I did the job for a few years. I'd done 3 budgets. I knew at some point John Fraser would be moving on, and I was kind of interested in principle in doing other things. What attracted me to the Productivity Commission when it became a possible option was twofold. I think the strong microeconomic focus of the PC, which is sort of has suited both my background and my kind of intellectual leanings, and in one sense, notwithstanding that I'd worked in a few high octane environments like ministerial offices and the like, I kind of felt as though the nature and style of work at the Productivity Commission suited me dispositionally more so than being in the Treasury, even though you're a bit closer to the action. So in addition to which I've had great regard for the PC and its predecessor organisations. So it seems to be a great thing to be part of.
Can you describe that a little bit, just where you, and I'm guessing you'd have a better sense for this than just about anybody else, given your role, obviously, but where do you, the PC is a very unique institution. Can you just, globally, if we can look at comparable jurisdictions, can you describe where you think the PC fits into the policy cycle in Australia? What is it? Is it initiating? Is it doing reviews in hindsight? What's the, how would you describe the PC's role in developing policy in the country?
So I think at its best, it's an organisation which can change the debate over the long term. Avowedly, we're not really into the short-term policy issues of the day, although sometimes we will have a report with recommendations that the government will enact reasonably quickly. But I think our most totemic work has been the work which has basically shifted opinion over a longer period of time. Mm-hmm. It is an interesting question you raise about what are the kind of global peers that the Productivity Commission has, because in a way, in recent years, there's been a bit of a move towards establishing productivity commissions or like bodies, at least notionally like bodies, across much of the OECD. And in fact, the European Commission has so it's actually a kind of requirement or edict that member nations establish some sort of productivity board, a bit like the PC. But often the function looks a little bit different. So in much of Europe, the nature of the entity tends to be one that's much more focused on productivity issues narrowly, so productivity research and the like. Where we have evolved as a commission is essentially to be a broad public policy advisor, albeit not always an advisor in the here and now. And there are fewer entities globally that share that characteristic, like that have that degree of independence from government, but are basically doing policy research across a broad range of things. New Zealand is similar. It's much smaller, and it doesn't have the same breadth of flexibility within its act to do its own self-initiated research and the like. But it's got a broadly similar remit, and it's a bit newer. So it's similar. But it's an unusual organisation in many ways, but it has been over the years a successful one.
It strikes me that productivity is one of, it's quite easily defined word in a dictionary definition, but it's broadly bastardised in public policy debate. And you even said then that the Productivity Commission's role is probably broader than just productivity as a lens, although that is a sort of a core element of what you do. I wonder if you could just explain what productivity is, or give us a brief history of productivity, or however you'd like to answer that, but a sense of what it means to the Productivity Commission and therefore to the policy work that you do.
Yeah. So mathematically, productivity is labour productivity, at least, is GDP per hour worked. That's the metric, right? So the total value of output produced in an economy divided by the amount of labour input. And a couple of things that are important about that. One is that it's a real quantity rather than a nominal quantity. So it's really not about the terms of trade or other kinds of nominal impacts on economic values. It's really about the real output. You're trying to get proxies for the real output that's delivered for the real input that's put into the process. Productivity is, in one sense, you could say it's a relatively recent phenomenon. Certainly productivity growth is a relatively recent phenomenon. One of the most remarkable things about human history is the fact that for thousands upon thousands of years, humans were basically very poor until the period in the Western world, in Great Britain and Western Europe, at the beginning of the 19th century, where suddenly real incomes just shot through the roof and continued on this steep upward trajectory, followed by the United States and later countries like Australia, and then followed yet later by countries such as Japan, South Korea, Singapore and the like, more recently China to some extent, where living standards just kind of rose and exploded kind of almost out of nowhere, and then continued on that astronomical rise. And that was but largely because human beings worked out how to do things smarter, how to basically get more output for less input, combination of invention, technological invention, but also institutions, a range of, if you like, social inventions like the limited liability company and the credit card and double entry bookkeeping and all those things that have kind of gone along with the physical technological inventions like steam and the ability to and then followed by electricity, followed ultimately by computing power and the like. So, in a way, that's been the path of human history in recent times, albeit it's gone through a bit of some waves and fluctuations. And when you drill down into more recent data, I guess you'd observe that in Australia, for example, we had a period where our relative productivity declined in the post-war period, say relative to the United States, and certainly relative to the remainder of the OECD, although the OECD was partly developed economies in Europe and the like were starting to rebuild from post-war devastation. But then in the 1990s and the 2000s, Australian living standards started to rise again. So we have had ebbs and flows within our own relative history. And that period of the 1990s, whilst opinions will differ about precisely where you attribute all of the causation for that period of high productivity growth, to a large extent it does appear to be a combination of the global influence of computing and IT technology, but also a dividend from the reforms of the 1980s in opening the Australian economy up to greater competition and the like. And the question I think before us as we look forward is how do you continue to drive those productivity improvements, which are ultimately the big driver of living standards.
So that period that you mentioned in the 90s, the microeconomic reform period there in the 80s and 90s, that was, as I understand it, that was one of the Productivity Commission's current iteration's primary functions, wasn't it? Overseeing and monitoring the reforms from the National Competition Policy. Is that it? Have I understood that background correctly? And can you talk us through a little bit more about how the Productivity Commission fell into that responsibility and what it was doing before that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The period of the 80s and 90s was a period of much reform, and to Adrian's earlier point, I think one where we probably look and impose great order and logic on it after the event, and the people who are most closely associated with it at the time often say, well, it's not, it wasn't quite as linear and sequential as you might think. The role of the Productivity Commission in its current form, and named the Productivity Commission, really only came about in 1998, 1999. So we're just over 20 years old. Prior to that, the entity had been the Industry Commission. Prior to that, the Industries Assistance Commission, and prior to that, the Tariff Board. And coming out of the period of the Tariff Board, particularly, the issue on with which the Tariff Board was most closely associated was obviously trade policy. And particularly around the 1960s, the Tariff Board basically had become more and more a strong advocate for freer trade and reduced trade protection in the Australian economy, which at that point put it a little on a collision course both with manufacturing but to some extent with agricultural interests in the Australian economy. And that followed through in its subsequent iterations as the IAC and then the Industry Commission in the 80s and early 90s. And I would still say that probably trade was the big thing. The reduction in tariff barriers to effectively open up domestic markets to greater import competition was probably the key thing on which I would say the PC's predecessors were involved. Though by the early 1990s, it was also starting to get terms of reference on a range of other industry reform issues, telecommunications and the like, government business enterprises, that sort of thing. And with NCP, it was I certainly wouldn't claim that NCP was invented or conceived by the PC's antecedents, but because it was more the government of the day and the bureaucracy of the day. But we did have a role in reviewing some of the effects of NCP and coming up with some estimates of the benefit. And so, in a way, I would say the Commission has been, certainly the Commission can't claim credit for every bit of economic reform that's ever occurred in Australia. That would be a massive stretch. But it's often been involved, either centrally in the context of trade or kind of a bit at the margins or as a partner entity in a range of other cases.
My observation would be that I've read some of that early work the Industry Commission did from the 90s, and lots of subsequent reports from the Productivity Commission over the last decade or so. And what's striking about them is that they were right at the time, and they're mostly right now. I mean, even some of those early 1990s Industry Commission reports that start to talk about things like road user charging, like ownership of energy networks and the appropriate way to corporatize and have different ownership models for utilities. All of that stuff is sensible reforms that have been done, I guess, opportunistically over the 30 years that have followed. But their opportunism built off there having been a roadmap created, or a true north created by the Industry Commission and then subsequently the Productivity Commission would be my kind of reflection on that creating that mean for governments to return to over time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think in some ways there were some strong kind of conceptual priors that the Commission had, but it was always at pains to test those priors against real-world evidence. So it was always, there would be a view about what was likely to be an ideal market structure with greater clarity, greater competition, but competition on the right sorts of the right sort of axes, if you like, well-regulated, well-informed competition and the like. Where structural separation might make sense or not, those sorts of things, always tested against real-world evidence. The thing that has probably shifted and evolved over time is that the range of topics with which the Commission is involved has broadened, and that's a long-term trend. This is not a recent thing, but from the late 1990s onwards, probably with the problem gambling inquiry, it was an example of the Commission being thrown an issue which was vexed, complex, challenging, but for which there was less of the sort of conventional market economic logic that you could just apply. I mean, the kind of superficial application of market principles would just be to say, well, people gamble, that's their choice. There's consumer surplus associated with that. We shouldn't really stand in the way of it. In reality, what the Commission did with that was to identify that as the superficial view and then to ask the question, well, how would you alter the conventional economic argument in the context of people who've got a problem? So if you're addicted to gambling, you're a problem gambler, what assumptions can we make about, to use the economic lingo, the area under the demand curve representing consumer surplus? Maybe you can't, because not every dollar of gambling for a problem gambler is a good thing for them. How can we best and most rigorously kind of reflect that in a bit of analysis that nonetheless maintains a bit of rigour? So the problem gambling was kind of a watershed, I think, for the Commission in terms of the application of rigorous principles, but to a slightly unconventional policy issue.
And then very early recognition that people don't always make 100% self-beneficial, rational decisions.
Correct. That's right. And particularly in certain settings. They may in some markets, but not others.
Can we dive into that just a little bit more? Because it's a very interesting point, just the breadth of issues that the Commission is dealing with. To something earlier that we were discussing, traditionally this kind of work in comparable jurisdictions, especially the UK and the US, is done by think tanks. The think tanks would be aligned either, they describe themselves as conservative or liberal or non-partisan, or they're funded by somebody, but you can generally try and unpick what their driving ideology is. And as you've just described, there's the Productivity Commission doesn't necessarily have that kind of predetermined driving ideology. But so, what would you describe it as? Is it driven by the commissioner? Is it driven by you? Is it driven by the Prime Minister at the time? Is there something else that unifies the conclusions that the Productivity Commission makes across such a wide range of policy discussions?
Look, I think there are still broad principles that ideally help these reports to hang together. And so we still try to bring a strong conceptual frame.
So how would you describe that?
Well, I think it's more, 20 years ago, I think there was probably a stronger sense that we brought with us a set of a kind of a house view, basically, that there should be less trade barriers, there should be more, concern about, the most regulation, on balance, or a lot of regulation was on balance fairly costly and the like. I think increasingly, because of the areas in which we have been operating, there's less of a perception that we're bringing particular priors, or that we have kind of a house view that's just getting applied to each thing. But I guess what we try to do is to identify, sort of start with some first principles and then test them against the evidence. We still probably start with, some basic priors that if we'd be looking to see whether individual consumer choice can work to drive both innovation and competition in a market. But we're open to the possibility that it's not necessarily going to work, or it won't work seamlessly, or it could actually be harmful in particular instances. But we'd be looking to kind of test the precise extent of that, I guess. I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples that are probably give you a bit of a sense of the real world application of these things. So using this study that we had done into Indigenous funding, or it's really about family services funding in the Northern Territory, but a lot of that funding is flowing into Indigenous communities because it's really the money that's there to protect against harm to children as a kind of preventative part of where the child protection services is the tertiary end. And I guess two areas on that where we would probably have brought priors would be, firstly, that this is an area where there's a lot of Northern Territory money and a lot of Commonwealth money. And our basic terms of reference were to try and untangle some of that spending, try and identify where it's being spent, but also identify are there better ways of spending it. For the most part, we probably would have come at this issue with a view that the subsidiarity principle was an important principle, i.e. that it was probably ideal for the tier of government that's closest to the ground to make most of the decisions. So that might militate in favour of the Commonwealth rather than delivering a whole lot of specific programs on the ground, maybe just cutting a cheque to the NT government, a national partnership arrangement, and letting the Northern Territory make those decisions. When you get into the actual reality on the ground, you realise that for a whole host of reasons, that's not really necessarily a particularly practical or desirable end. It's going to be very difficult to provide those sorts of clear lines of accountability. There are plenty of stakeholders on the ground who actually want to have both jurisdictions heavily involved. There are often good reasons why certain things shouldn't be funded by the Northern Territory government, but should be funded. And so we kind of had to step back a little bit from that and try and identify, well, how can you at least get two tiers of government to work more closely together in a more integrated fashion, but moving away from what might have been the kind of the superficial initial view of, oh, well, we'll just replace two tiers of government with one. That would be so much simpler. A similar issue arose in relation to the question of evaluation of money being spent, where, the conventional view, I guess, for a lot of economists and a lot of policymakers is, well, what you want is robust, quantitative, data-led evaluation of the standard of like a randomised control trial. You really need to have a control group in order to assess what is the impact of the intervention that you're putting in place, etc. Again, when you get to looking at the specifics of the context in which you're operating here, you start to realise, well, hang on a minute, that's going to be impossible in this world. There are, you can go to an individual Indigenous community and find that there are 20, 30, 40 individual programs running in parallel. So how on earth are you ever going to kind of distill the isolated impact of the particular thing, that a particular program that an agency is running in that area? So you're going to have a huge attribution problem. The idea of running, evaluations, quantitative evaluations on an RCT type standard is fanciful. So you've just got to kind of get your hands dirty and work out what's feasible in that sort of circumstance. And I just think more and more of our work is a bit along those lines. I apologise, slightly long-winded answer, but more and more there are instances where you might bring a particular initial view, and then you test it against the evidence, and you find, well, actually, it's not. That initial view isn't quite as strong as we might thought.
Is that to some extent driven by all the big things having been done, and you're now being asked to do more granular? You take on more granular challenges, more tricky,
more wicked challenges.
Yeah, I think that is possible. Yeah, I mean, there are no doubt still big issues that are, and potentially big issues that are amenable to the big lever, if you like. I guess it's maybe it's not the scale of the issue so much as the nature of the policy solution. But there are a number of big issues associated with Aboriginal disadvantage, for example, or the lack of integration in our health system between the different parts, Commonwealth, state, etc. But they are less amenable to the pulling of the big lever. You cut this tax rate, or you cut the tariff, or you float the dollar. And I'm always a bit wary of that sort of account, in part because I never want to be construed as saying that those past reforms were easy, because they were anything but. They were intellectually challenging, and they were politically challenging. These ones, it's just that the nature of the solution, I think, is often a bit different. Often we're talking about a kind of an ongoing evolutionary process. If you think about how do you get a more integrated health system, well, it's probably not a big single pulling of a tax lever or a regulatory lever. And yeah, they're hard. I mean, all these issues are hard, but...
So how are they coming to you, Michael? Are they? It's let me explain a little bit of the context, because Obama actually said something kind of similar at some stage during his term, that the easy solutions don't come to my desk; they're dealt with somewhere else. So the trickiest ones are the ones that are supposed to come to you. What do you? Are they? Is government always coming to you with tricky questions that they want solved? Are you sometimes self-initiating inquiries that you just feel like need addressing? What's the balance, and how does it usually happen?
So about 80% of our work, there's a rough figure, but 80% of our work will come from government. So it will come in the form of terms of reference to us. It does vary in its nature. So I'd divide it along two axes. One is, I think there is about, of the work we get from government, you could say roughly half is of a conventional microeconomic kind of character. So the report we did, for example, into the regulation of airports, or we recently did a review on national transport regulation, I would say that fits within a fairly traditional economic sort of classification for slightly artificial distinction. And then some of it is things like the report we got underway in mental health, or we had a veterans report earlier in the year, and the like. So some areas that broadly classified as social policy. So I think that's one axis of the division or classification. The other is probably the scale. So there are some that we get that are very, very significant issues, which are get a lot of attention and are quite salient in the community and broad-based. So mental health is an example of that. I'd say the superannuation work that we did now a couple of years ago is in that category. But we get a lot of smaller scale stuff too. We're involved often in a report or an area that's of particular interest or focus for a sector, for a jurisdiction, like the work we did on the Northern Territory. And so with all that, it's good to have the mix. It's good to have the blockbusters. It's good to have the more localised or narrow things. They're always interesting, even when they may not be necessarily the sort of groundbreaking big reform issues.
But what's the secret sauce that makes a treasurer or someone or whoever ends up referring the work to you? What's the secret ingredient that means Productivity Commission is best placed to solve it, rather than energy has God knows how many regulatory governance agencies that might also be capable of doing it? When do they decide? Do you think that's it? This is a problem for Michael Brennan.
Yeah, I think that the three basic ingredients we bring to the table are, firstly, typically time. So a normal inquiry would take around 12 months. So it does, whilst it's not in practice ever as long as it sounds, it's a fair investment of time. We do have independence, and independence not merely from the immediate ebb and flow of what's going on in the political world, but also independence in the sense that we're not a stakeholder in the immediate issue, right? So we're not, we undertake a report into mental health, but we're not a health body, or we're not a peak body for mental health practitioners or anything like that. So there is no sense of ownership or interest, if you like, as in vested interest in where we're coming from. And the final thing is, I think there is a very institutionalised and rigorous process of seeking public input. So the fact that there's a mandatory process of putting out an issues paper, taking public submissions, putting out a draft report, which is public, and then people can hurl stones at it and disagree and agree, whatever, and a public debate can ensue, and a process of public hearings, typically for a full inquiry and further submissions, is just a process that I think can give government a degree of comfort that all viewpoints are being accommodated. They're not necessarily all of equal persuasion, right? And they won't all win the day, but at least there's a process by which, and a transparent process by which, these alternative viewpoints can be canvassed.
Michael, you've spoken extensively there about the long-term nature, the arm's length from the day-to-day, but I think all of us right now, and we're speaking in early May 2020, are consumed to some extent by the here and now because of COVID-19. Maybe you could talk us through what role you think the Productivity Commission can have, and both now in the immediate recovery from this crisis, but the longer term perhaps opportunities that arise from reforms that will follow coronavirus, and what the Commission's role will be in that process.
Yeah, I think it's important that we, like everybody else, have to adapt a bit to the circumstance. And nobody is left completely unchanged, right, by the challenges of the coronavirus. So even, for us, in thinking about our medium-term work, both the work that we'll get from government and the sort of research that we would do, which is the other 20% of the work, the self-initiated research that we would do, we have to be very mindful, I think, and invest a bit in determining what our best view about how the economy might evolve coming out of COVID-19. So I think the pandemic has required that we probably put greater focus on how the economy is evolving, how the economy is likely to evolve in the months and years ahead, which at one level is very, very difficult to know, right? We're still at a point where I think there's great uncertainty. But we're probably more focused on that as a contextual factor for our work than we would normally be, I think. At a matter of practicality, we are, by our nature, as I said, we're an entity that undertakes work that we think is important, obviously. It's not always work that's urgent. And at the peak of the health response to the pandemic and all of the focus of the APS really had to be on kind of how do we ensure that we're delivering services, getting good policy advice to government and the like. And they're not things that the Productivity Commission traditionally does. We don't, quite unashamedly, that's not really us. So we have, just as a matter of practicality, sought to provide a bit of assistance to agencies that are more closely involved in the COVID response. We've made the offer of people to provide a bit of backfill and overflow capacity to the Treasury, both in terms of people, but also the ability to undertake a bit of analysis here and there that could feed into Treasury advice, just noting that the Treasury and the central agencies have been at times very, very stretched, trying to deal with the demands of what they were confronting. And we felt we had potentially some staff capability which could assist in that direction. Now, you never want to get too sucked into the day-to-day stuff, but it was kind of consistent with a view that we should all be doing our bit. And but it has also helped us, I think, to kind of form a bit of a view about what might the priorities be coming out of this, and what might the world look like, which, as I say, is still very uncertain.
So, do you expect the government will that the best use of the PC will be to dust off some of the earlier reform recommendations, or is there something different that is likely to be needed in the short and medium term?
Well, in a way, the government's been explicit about the fact that some past Productivity Commission work will be informative in helping guide a bit of the post policy in the recovery and post-recovery phase, including the Shifting the Dial report from 2017. So that's pleasing that the aspects of past Commission reports remain informative and potentially persuasive and influential with government. As to where else our attentions might be directed, that is largely a matter for government.
What's your hunch, without preempting some extensive inquiry? What do we need to do for stimulus, and what's the government likely to pursue to get us out of this situation?
I wouldn't dare speculate about where we might be involved. I think, but the government has been pretty explicit, and I think the National Cabinet as a whole pretty explicit that, partly informed by the views that both the Reserve Bank Governor and the Treasury Secretary have put to them, that policy in the future, as the Prime Minister put it, will need to be more pro-growth and explicitly pro-growth than perhaps it had been in the past, reflecting both the need for as rapid a possible path to recovery, but also beyond that, we'll be in a world where we will need to boost productivity growth to deal with the legacy issues of this episode. There'll be a fiscal bill to be paid, and
a generic sense about a stimulus then, Michael, that infrastructure, I think, has rightly been spoken about as a potential or almost intrinsic part of any future stimulus that's required, and by all levels of government. But the objective of a stimulus is to primarily to get money into the economy. So you could see, therefore, that productivity might not be helped by the objective of simply getting people employed. So there's good stimulus and bad stimulus from a productivity perspective. Do you think there's a role that organisations like the Productivity Commission, maybe some of the other independent bodies that are around the Infrastructure Australia and those types of organisations could play in making sure that there is any stimulus that's delivered is a good stimulus, that it does do things that enhance productivity over time, it does things that are sort of the optimised end of that equation?
Yeah, I mean, without speculating about our role, it's an important question, and it's an important part of the policy debate. I mean, I think in a way there is, you're right to say there's often a trade-off between the idea of getting money into the economy quickly versus getting money well spent. And, when I think back, for example, to the 2008-9 episode, there were often states had contrasting approaches to spending the money that was part of the Building the Education Revolution agenda, for example. Some that wanted to, consistent with the idea of stimulus, get the money out there as quickly as possible, but often it ended up being poorly spent. Other states that wanted to take the time to make sure the projects were, well scoped and the like, but of course then the money was being spent well down the track long after the case for stimulus had, in a macroeconomic sense, kind of passed. And that is a kind of salient lesson, I think, that there can be a trade-off between something that gives you the right macroeconomic impact early versus what might help build greater productivity growth over time. I suspect that's really that has been the thinking of Governor Lowe in talking a lot about infrastructure, because it's potentially the sort of thing that can tick more than one box. It can get some money flowing into the economy, but it can be building assets, if they're well selected and well executed, that can then have a productivity dividend for the community in time.
And there's also, I think, one of the things that's emerged that's different to the sort of 2008 piece that you spoke about is that a view that governments are going to need to support aggregate demand in the economy for a fairly long time, just because of the depth of this, the economic impact of this, the economic scarring that will occur, the permanent job losses. There's probably a need to look at those smaller, high velocity projects, but also the big, chunky, longer term, higher productivity impact things, because they will support the economy for that extended period of time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in one sense, we don't know, but the longer, or as things evolve, I guess, more and more, I guess we're realising that what we will see is at best a progressive relaxation of restrictions, such that there will be some restrictions that remain in place for quite some time. That'll have economic impact, and so even if in aggregate the economy can kind of bounce back quickly, there'll be some compositional change within the economy, and there may well need, as you say, be a need to kind of maintain a focus on boosting economic activity for longer.
So what we're discussing now, in some sense, is, I guess, the demand boosting measures, macroeconomic policies in some respect, and infrastructure, I guess, crosses both of those lines in the sense that it's demand boosting and productivity boosting potentially, as you mentioned, if it's the right project. Is there any? We've heard a few things from a few rumblings from treasurers that I'm sure gave you some confidence that we might see the removal of stamp duty replaced with land tax. There's been some discussion of road pricing. What do you think? Is there anything that for the Productivity Commission, out of those major infrastructure-related policy areas, that is priority number one? You think that is high impact and also relatively easy to do tomorrow? And sorry, that's an exaggeration. Obviously, none of them are easy, but implementable.
No, nothing's easy, and there's probably not a single priority number one. But I guess when I look back on the Shifting the Dial report from 2 or 3 years ago, there are probably 3 areas that jump out as being areas which are potentially, a bit broad areas that are kind of actionable and important in the current environment. One is regulatory policy. One is everything that was brought together under the banner of cities policy, and one is everything that was brought together under the banner of skills policy. So on the cities policy, it was partly about the robust selection of projects for infrastructure, but also it did get into the question of pricing infrastructure use. And on that, I mean, there aren't quick wins because you have to move gradually, but I think there's a fair degree of consensus now that we need to both replace as a revenue source the fuel excise for the purposes of road funding, and also ensure that we have an equitable sharing of the burden of road funding, and also ultimately that some pricing can play a role in potentially easing congestion, that you can't ultimately fully build your way out of congestion. You're going to need some price signal to contribute to that. But I see that as a long journey. I think it's just the main issue there is that we should make a start and try and develop solutions which are politically sustainable, to ensure that there's a kind of it's a steady journey, without, to strain the metaphor, too many bumps in the road. I think a lesson on stamp duty and land tax. I mean, again, this is an area where there's been very strong consensus from economists, policymakers, politicians themselves. The challenge has been that it is both fiscally and politically very hard, because the stamp duty has hitherto raised very substantial amounts of money. I mean, in not so much right now, but in go back a year or so, it would have raised about $8 billion or so in New South Wales, maybe about $6 in Victoria. So it's a very difficult tax to replace fully.
Does that make now the best time to pursue that kind of policy, given that there's no revenue to lose at the moment? It's gonna, well, it's not zero, but there's really very few houses changing hands. Is now the best time to implement that kind of change?
Well, possibly. I mean, it is. Ultimately that'll be a kind of a judgment to be made by state governments. But I think there's a case to be made for that. That it becomes a little easier when the revenue isn't quite as bountiful.
So I want to go back to the road user charging thing, if we can, and I particularly like your framing around charging first and pricing second, because I think that accords with our view about how it should be approached. But your predecessor, Peter Harris, gave a speech towards the very end of his tenure as chair of the commission, saying that it was his road user charging was the one area, the last great unpriced utility, being roads, and that it was the sort of one regret from his career to that point in public life that there hadn't been more progress made on it. You mentioned pragmatism, incrementalism. Where do you think that sort of spark of the start of the thin end of the wedge of reform in road user charging might emerge?
Yeah. So I don't have a really strict view that it has to be charging before pricing, for example, though that's an arguable case because it's consistent, maybe consistent with that kind of incremental view. I do think that the combination of a fiscal challenge, if not a burning platform, certainly the fiscal challenge of the fact that the excise revenue will continue to fall in real terms and as a share of GDP, and that leaves a revenue problem for governments collectively to deal with in terms of funding road improvements, and you've got to get the money from somewhere. So I think that contributes to the case, and I also think there is an emerging equity case around the use of electric vehicles in particular, but fuel efficient vehicles in general. That paying for the upkeep of roads really should be independent of the source of fuel that you're using, and so I think there is a case to at least step in and start to ensure a bit of equity in the contributions being made. So maybe there is an opening for governments at the moment to try and move a bit down this path. Not so much for kind of abstract economic reasons, but just the very practical issues of making sure that we do have a robust funding source and that people are contributing to it in an equitable way.
So if I can just unpack that, so that's consistent with the sorts of things Infrastructure Partnerships Australia has said about ensuring that those ultra fuel efficient and electric vehicles are brought into the charging regime or the funding regime in an equivalent way to the sort of average of fuel excise that's raised from other vehicles.
I think there's a case to be made. And in a way, the two things obviously are linked, because the reason the excise is falling in real terms is because of the penetration of fuel efficient and electric vehicles. So I think there's a case to be made for a new way of doing things, and that would be perfectly consistent with a very evolutionary approach.
Do you have a sense, Michael, for what's been holding transport back? And it's not just roads; it's public transport. Cost recovery is abysmal. There was a period that the four major sort of economic infrastructure sectors went through in the 90s, which we discussed earlier, where that corporatization and cost recovery were driving objectives of that period. How did transport get left off that reform agenda? And is it is it something is there something fundamental that makes it more difficult in transport than those other sectors?
That's a very interesting question because it's hard to identify the thing that would really separate it. I mean, yes, they're broadly based services used by a lot of people where there's you're paying a price which is fairly transparent, but of course it's true of energy, telecommunications, water, and the like. So it is hard to know kind of what separates it. I mean, I wonder whether sometimes some clear-headed analysis is required on what the trade-offs are. It strikes me that sometimes the decision-making around cost recovery, say on the public transport network, is not really so much a decision about cost recovery per se. It's not, it's in my experience not always the case that state cabinets or expenditure review committees are sitting down making a really strategic decision about where they want to take the overall level of cost recovery from the system over time and how that's going to translate into incremental annual steps. It's often kind of an annual decision taken pretty late in the year preceding. What should fares go up by on January 1st? Should it be CPI? Should it be something else?
There was IPART had the unenviable task for a long time of pretending to back solve a cost recovery against a regulated asset base for transport in New South Wales, and I think in this determination they've given up on it because it's impossible when cost recovery is 20%. I mean, it's just a completely different exercise. It's not the quantifiable exercise that you were describing there.
No, and at least the IPART process had some degree of transparency, even if governments could then choose what's the level of cost recovery that we're going to pitch for. But of course, most states don't even have that.
Yeah,
so they don't have the arm's length analysis going on. I think in a lot of places there's kind of a view that it would be unfair to recover too much money from the public transport system because that might only encourage use of private transport, so that those questions start to loom large. Of course, those two things aren't always necessarily close substitutes. People are using the two modes of transport for quite different reasons, quite different types of transport within our cities. But it is hard. It is hard to know why has it been difficult to get a more rigorous discussion. I mean, there may well be good reasons why you wouldn't 100%. Obviously,
sure.
Public transport fares. It's just the fact that there's not at the moment any particularly scientific process to determine what is the appropriate level.
Do you see I guess PwC is actually doing some thought leadership work on this right now. It's an interesting issue because the end state has been defined. We all know that the where the objective that is ideal for the sector, for in a road pricing and public transport fares sense. What seems to be missing is the answer to that question that you were trying to answer before. What are the interim steps? Why can't we do it? Do you see a role for the Productivity Commission in doing the thinking there? Or because I guess your traditional role would be helping define that long-term objective. Do you see a role to help develop those more interim measures that will get us to the long-term objective?
Yeah, I potentially do. I think it's often a debate that we grapple with internally ourselves. Is our role to kind of identify the end state, or is our role to identify the precise path by which to get there? And sometimes the problem with trying to identify the precise path is not so much that it might involve us in the murky business of implementation, which can be murky, but so much as we want to be respectful of the things that we uniquely bring to the table versus the things where others might have a comparative advantage. So often it's the case that people in government agencies and government ministers themselves got a pretty good idea how to implement something once they've got a sense of what the end point is. And we're not so much the experts in that, so we should just identify the end point and let them go with it. I think it's the question is, what are those instances where applying a bit of judgment you can kind of see that government's grappling with these issues, but they just don't have a really clear way through, and often don't really have the time to give it much thought. And probably the stamp duty land tax issue fits a bit into that category. And I think maybe radios are charging a little bit too. What are some of the way? What is the sensitivity sorry, transport pricing in general? What is the sensitivity, and how can you try and identify a few options that would at least help government through? Is there only one way, for example? And I think it is good within limits for agencies like ourselves to be a little bit involved in those things, not to dilute our overall mission of identifying endpoints, but having a little bit of an eye to what are some of the practical options that could help get government there.
You gave us a brief history of productivity. I might just ask you to get your crystal ball out and tell us what the future of productivity is.
Well, it's a very good question. I think in the immediate term, you can look back on past historical episodes of how have economies fared as they have come out of recessionary periods. But I don't know that that's going to be a particularly reliable guide in this instance. I mean, coming out of the 1990s, we had a significant recession with a lot of shedding of labour and the like. But that is an episode where we saw reasonably rapid bounce back in demand and economic growth through 1993, 1994, etc. And actually the 1990s, brought about a significant uptick in measured labour productivity. Now, there are people whom I respect who would actually note that some of that productivity uplift may have been a measurement issue, that there were actually resources, both labour and capital, which were effectively notionally being utilised as per the statistics, but in reality being underutilised through the period of the recession. And then as they came to full of capacity utilisation, it was sort of showing up as an increase in output without an increase in input, ipso facto increase in productivity growth. And I think there is potentially something to that explanation, though I doubt that it's the whole story. The question is, will we see something similar coming out of this episode? I mean, part of the challenge is whether or not, how quick it will be. I think, productivity no doubt has taken a bit of a hit from the challenge of remote working combined with homeschooling and the like. So I don't know that we will see necessarily a really quick uptick in measured productivity. We may, as I said, see a requirement that some labour shifts, from sector to sector and occupation to occupation. That it's not just a case of everyone going back to the job they were doing in February 2020. We may well see, to the extent that some restrictions remain with us, a need for some structural adjustment in the economy. And all of that, to me, suggests that it may take time for productivity growth to rebound. But that's speculative.
A follow-up question to that, which is, are our measures, our economic measures, productivity and others, adequate for the world as it is now? One thinks about a lot of the massive impact information technology and data has had on the world of work over the past 2 decades. And we think we're all a lot more productive, but maybe that hasn't come out in the way it's measured. Are there frailties to the measurement, or is it just that these things haven't been as impactful on productivity as we think they have?
It's potentially a bit of both, Adrian. I think there are frailties to the measures, but to some extent there always have been. As people will point out, in the recovery from natural disasters and the like, you have a big building effort which doesn't actually improve well-being compared with the pre-existing situation, is rebuilding assets that you used to have and then lost, but it all shows up as growth. So in one sense, the idea of GDP, a kind of output-based notion of GDP has always been, to some extent, if not misleading, at least incomplete as a guide to economic well-being. I think the question as to whether or not there is significant productivity growth that's being missed by the statistics is an interesting one. I mean, in one sense, it is entirely possible because that there is a bit of that going on, though respected commentators basically are of the view that it's just not big enough. It's not plausibly big enough to explain the slow productivity growth that we've observed over the last decade. So it can't all be a measurement problem. And I guess one way of kind of keeping it anchored in the real world is, just as we know that over the long term, real wage growth and productivity growth, labour productivity growth, have tended to move hand in hand. The fact that we have seen slow real wage growth tells you something about what underlying productivity growth actually is, and that suggests that it's been relatively slow. On the longer term question of where to with productivity growth, I will say this. I think the big issue that we will confront is that we have seen a couple of things that have driven productivity growth in the past, which have been significant waves, if you like, and often get referred to as general purpose technologies like electricity, a big new technology that then can be rolled out quite broadly across the economy and and often spawns further innovations. And there's a bit of a debate about whether AI could be of that kind of, that significance in the same way that electricity was, and maybe coal before that. The one thing that I think is an interesting thing to think about in terms of how economies will continue to maintain strong productivity growth is what strong productivity growth looks like in a services-based economy. Because in many of our traditional goods-producing economies, agriculture, manufacturing, mining, for the most part, productivity growth has been a long and continuous process of automation, basically more and more technology being added to the production process, often to automate labour input, which has thereby kind of created a higher output for the labour input, and that's generated a lot of benefits, well-being benefits, lower prices and rises in living standards to people. When you think about all those things that, we do these calculations on how long it took you to work in order to afford various things in 1900 versus today, and all this, the hours worked to purchase all these things come well down. To the extent that services tend to be a bit more labour intensive, it's often been harder to kind of automate the labour input into a whole lot of services. I think we're learning a bit about it now in the current climate in health, in education, and the like. How do you deliver good education content online? How do you deliver a meaningful health consultation online? That sort of thing. But that's one of the challenges, I think, in a services-based economy. How do you continue to drive innovation and automation that in those contexts, which have often proven to be a little bit stubborn to that approach. It just doesn't seem quite as linear as it's often been in an area like manufacturing.
So you're suggesting that that's potentially that next step change in industrial output, I guess, that equivalent to electricity. I think there's a similar discussion going on in other jurisdictions that have a lot more manufacturing, that of just how much of an impact that'll have on employment. Do you have a sense for how that will impact Australia? Is Australia likely to see not likely, but is it a big risk for Australia that it'll come with a significant onset of automation and unemployment as a result that doesn't get replaced by new jobs?
Prior to the pandemic, and assuming that this is not something that changes radically due to the pandemic, I have been sceptical about the claims of mass unemployment due to automation, in part because we just haven't been seeing it.
Yep.
So it's been inconsistent with the sluggish rate of growth in labour productivity. It just hasn't been consistent with a mass automation story. I mean, I think the things that the analysis that I find most persuasive is that, for the most part, it's tasks within jobs that get automated rather than entire jobs themselves. Most jobs are a bundle of quite automatable with less automatable things. A bit of human judgment combined with something that you could automate, and it's that bit that can get automated that's often made our jobs easier. And so I think what does that imply in policy terms probably implies that for most people, the task is really how to maintain your currency, how to maintain, through constant upskilling, kind of augmenting your human capital to make sure you're continuously adapting to take advantage of the technologies that come along, rather than technology being a threat, an existential threat to your employability, full stop.
Now, Michael, we've asked all of our guests, and I think we're at 16 or 17 guests on this podcast now. We've asked them all one question to finish, and it's the big question. It's, what's your favourite type of infrastructure and why?
Gee, that's a very good question. Yeah, I don't know. I think
And just for context, the economists that we've had have always struggled the most to answer it. Everyone that's all the engineers have said they like a road or a bridge. The economists are always the deepest thinkers that need to really figure out what it is that they like the most.
When I ask this question, I want an economist to say a well-priced one.
It's very, very good point. I mean, I don't know. Like I like a good freeway. There is something about when this is totally kind of at odds. It should be a toll road. There should be appropriate pricing and to ration use and that sort of thing. But there is something about new bits of road infrastructure when they first become available. There's something kind of new and exciting about that.
Yeah, the free bit before they put the toll on.
Well, yeah, maybe that's it. But even allowing for paying for it, yeah, I should really say a road with a cordon charge and a gantry and a cordon charge, shouldn't I?
I think we've come to a natural conclusion off the back of your appreciation for a well-priced infrastructure asset. So, Michael Brennan, thank you very much for joining us on Inside Infrastructure.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael.
Well, that's it for today. Thanks as always to PwC Australia for their continued sponsorship of Inside Infrastructure. Please make sure you subscribe on your favourite podcast platform and leave us a rating or a comment on LinkedIn. If you have any suggestions for guests, then please feel free to send those to either Ilya or myself. We've certainly appreciated the messages we've been receiving so far. This episode was recorded and edited by Adam Stevens from TAG, PwC Australia's internal media agency. Research was conducted by Linda Bierschen, Brendan Pearce and Michael Player.